Trudeau, I guess he's on vacation right now or something like that. I don't know. He's escaped to a vacation spot, but there's a lot of pressure on him, and I hear that he's not too popular these days in Canada. What's going on?
Well, let's hope that that's true. But to your earlier point about the Dutch farmers' protests and what we've seen in Sri Lanka, of course, you're right. There's this global interconnectedness between what I view as many of our criminal governments unifying on a particular front that they describe as climate change or global warming. And the remedy is always the same: to further empower them, to further enrich them, to protect us from ourselves. So we as free individuals cannot be trusted to make the right choices that would lead to preservation of the planet in the face of these things that they describe as existential planetary threats. So on the specific side, in terms of the details of these proposals, we've got these forthcoming restrictions on fertilizer consumption related to greenhouse gas emissions that the government attributes to the use of these fertilizers for agricultural production. And if I recall correctly, the particular targets are something like a 40% reduction below what they define as 2005 levels by 2030. And by 2050, they want to get to so-called net zero. That's, of course, a buzz phrase or catchphrase that I'm sure you guys and the audience are familiar with. Again, just total surrender to government control to protect us from ourselves, to stop all consumption of fossil fuels and production of greenhouse gases through normal human endeavor.
Now, I understand that there is one difference between Sri Lanka and the Netherlands and Canada in that Trudeau's government isn't mandating it, at least not yet. They're simply setting goals. Have you heard that?
I've heard that, but there are also going to be taxes coming down the line. So there will be measures through government coercion to enforce compliance. Remember that all of these endeavors would never be accepted voluntarily by a free population. That's why all of these things that we regularly speak about in terms of governmental abuses always come through the iron fist of the state.
Mr. Krychik, you know, this is obviously, like you mentioned just a minute ago, a weaponization of this so-called green agenda, right? And it's supposed to help the people down the line. You know, if you look at their intentions, it seems on the surface, oh yeah, well, this is going to benefit you, but ultimately, what it's going to have, the effect that it's going to have, it's going to cut down the amount of food that's in the supply chain. I'm wondering how much agriculture is based in Canada and how much of that will impact Canadians.
Well, I'm going to gently disagree with you in terms of what I think is an assumption on your part of good faith on the part of the government, or at least you're just throwing it out there to be charitable. You use the word intentions. I don't even accept the premise that our overlords have good intentions. But even if I do, for the sake of discussion, we all are familiar with the phrase. Okay, there we go. So we're on the same page. So, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and you better be very concerned about people who are absolutely certain of the morality and righteousness of their cause when they're telling you that they need to protect you from yourself. But now, in your specific question, I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to the question of how much agriculture is actually produced in Canada. I know it's enough. You know, we produce quite a bit, and as far as it helping people down the line, as you put it, of course, that's not the case. And I think we can describe this as most government endeavors, where the marketing to us of this control that they seek over us is always that we will benefit from surrendering our individual sovereignty and from giving them more of the fruits of our labors. Right? This is how they always justify their encroachments, their abuses, and their parasitism. Now, real life impact, of course, it just makes life worse in terms of, at a bare minimum, making life more expensive. And this is something, of course, your mostly American audience can relate to. We're seeing this government-driven, manufactured artificial inflation through many mechanisms, including what you and I are describing right now, which is this so-called green agenda, which drives up costs for the production of just calories to sustain human beings.
You know, it's funny. You made me think about the verbiage that's used in the Biden administration here in the United States about our current economic situation. They refuse to call it a recession. Instead, they call it a transition, which leads to the question, transition to what exactly? And then here we are dealing with these sort of global trends, these common denominators that we see across the planet, and this fertilizer nitrogen emissions reduction by 2030. Golly gee whiz, I wonder what that year's going to look like. Is a major problem. And to the point Rudy made a minute ago, Canadian farmers are warning this is going to be less food, which means people are going to likely starve. Now, maybe Canadians, Americans, maybe we have just enough excess to not starve to death. But what does this mean for the people who depend on Canadian food, depend on American crops, or like the bread, the grain that comes out of the Ukraine, which they have less of today? We are seeing starvation in parts of Africa and the Middle East and other parts. Why would these governments be so tone deaf to the actual casualties and impact on people's lives? Why do they think this is just numbers on paper?
Okay, a few things. First, you mentioned that people in less fortunate countries with less prosperity, more poverty, are going to be affected by these policies. Of course, that's true because a lot of agricultural products are global commodities. So when we artificially drive up the cost of production of this or that grain, this or that source of calories, it has a global impact. And of course, we know there are parts of this world in which people are struggling and even failing to have enough prosperity to even put sufficient calories on the table for themselves and their families. So this, of course, will lead to more hardship, more starvation, more disaster for the very people that our governments typically claim to be concerned about. Now, you mentioned tone deafness. Again, I'll get on my soapbox and speculate as to motivations. I can't read the government's mind any better than you guys can, but I'll give you my 2 cents. I just think as we go into this direction of disconnection between government and the population and the citizens, and a diminished degree of accountability on the part of the government via increased centralization of control, consolidation of power in places like DC or Ottawa, where I live, people become more tone deaf, to take your term. They're not accountable. They're not concerned because they are becoming detached from consequences. So I just think this will worsen until there is some sort of consequence faced by those people who impose these abuses upon us.
I was watching some commentary from Canadian farmers, and this particular farmer was saying, listen, we already look for ways to reduce fertilizer use because it's in our best interest to maximize our business. And so we're always looking to be more efficient in the use of fertilizer. Use it when it's necessary, not when it's not. Why does the government feel like they have to step in now? Is Trudeau's government just showboating, just trying to appease, his the globalist cause? I mean, I don't know. I guess I'm trying to understand because the farmers seem to think they got this. They don't need the help.
Again, I can't read Trudeau's mind any better than anyone else. I can tell you what they're saying. Trudeau and other government officials like himself are expressing concern over what they describe as climate change and global warming. So ostensibly, all of these proposed controls are about saving the planet from doom. Now, there is a consolidated push by multiple governments towards this end. And we're seeing it in the Netherlands, like you mentioned, seeing it in Sri Lanka. We're also seeing it in the US. Of course, climate change is a major driving pretext of the Biden administration. Now, as far as what Canadian farmers are doing, I went to a rally demonstration recently in downtown Ottawa, which was in support of the Dutch farmers' protests. And people that I spoke to there saw these global interconnections. They understand that there is a broader aegis from the so-called United Nations, from let's say Agenda 2050 or whatever new year in the future is, this target from the so-called World Economic Forum. And remember, the prescription, the remedy, the medicine is always the same: greater centralization of control, further erosion of individual freedom and responsibility, and just this sort of technocratic, presumably, control over the rest of our lives. And again, just want to link it to American audiences. The reason it's germane is because this same ethos, this same ideology, this vision is ubiquitous. And of course, the dominant flavor of your current executive branch in the White House.
Let me bring this in. So recently we saw that the Canadian government requires an app you have to have it in order to travel back and forth. And there was this famous video of this woman trying to come into Canada, Canadian citizen who had been vaccinated but didn't have the app. And they still confined her for 14 days. I mean, it seems bizarre. That's a CCP China kind of thing. Why would the Canadian government adopt such control as the CCP would advise? I mean, we've seen it in Australia. Now we're seeing it in Canada. It just, again, I just feel like it's very bizarre to see Western countries adopt and embrace these ideas. It's very draconian.
Perhaps I'm a little bit more jaded or cynical in some ways than you are, because I actually don't find it surprising. I sort of expect this to continue and worsen and exacerbate. So again, the pretext here is that people can't be trusted to be free in the context of what they call the COVID-19 pandemic. I describe that as an enterprise. And by the way, just before I forget, I kind of want to have one common denominator unifying theme between what I view as these criminal enterprises. There's always a financial dimension and particular beneficiaries to all of these government decreed restrictions. So whether it's so-called green technology or the so-called green transition, to use your word, or whether it's ostensibly public health in the context of a viral outbreak, there are always going to be interests, individuals, companies, organizations, and government that financially benefit from that control because, you know, these injections aren't free, right? These green technologies, so-called, are not free. So I guess I'm just using that familiar follow the money type ethos, even though to go to a very broad theme that you guys describe or touch on regularly, I do think that material acquisition and love of money are actually subsidiary components of a broader thirst for power, which I relate to a sort of spiritual conflict that we are now in the midst of.
Now, Brian Lilly from the Toronto Sun is saying that he thinks Trudeau will call an election this fall. If he does, what would that mean?
You have to forgive me, guys. I don't have particular familiarity there. I will defer to Brian Lilly. I love him, revere him. I would hope that that would lead to some sort of erosion of power held by the so-called Liberal Party and its allies, the so-called New Democratic Party. But we will see in time.
Okay. I hope the Canadians vote well. That's all I'm going to say.
I hope so,
too. Let's switch subjects altogether. You put out an article yesterday. Florida Education Commissioner says USDA trying to hold poor kids hostage with food program to impose transgender policies. What's going there?
Yeah, so we had Manny Diaz on the radio on one of our Breitbart radio programs on Sirius XM, and he was describing how the Biden administration via the USDA is threatening to withhold funding for food programs at public schools across your country if they don't comply with what they describe as the so-called transgender inclusivity program. Now, of course, I don't even accept the premise that transgender is a legitimate term. It's a nonsense neologism. We can go into that later. But this is all about the usual stuff that you and your audience, I'm sure, are familiar with, that somehow Florida schools, in order to get that money from the government that they're obviously paying for, their own Floridian residents are paying for this, right, through their own federal taxes, need to change bathroom regulations and allow boys into girls' bathrooms as long as those boys claim to identify whatever that means as a girl or vice versa, the destruction of sexual segregation in child's sporting events, and worst of all, the integration of indoctrination that they describe, they meaning the Biden administration would describe as curriculum or education regarding so-called transgender realities and just overall sexual corruption of children.
You know, it's interesting because I think this is going to be one of the main techniques they're going to try to cram down their policies, their ideologies into states here in the United States that are more conservative and don't want these things. I would think abortion's next on the agenda here. But what I have to imagine DeSantis isn't going to stand by idly and just let this happen. Now, what's the plan?
Well, last I saw, and it was included, I think, in that article that DeSantis signed, maybe it was a month ago or maybe 2 months ago, might have been April, a new bill, which was called, if I recall correctly, the Parental Rights and Education Bill. And I didn't go through the details, but presumably it empowers parents to have more control over what their children are subjected to. And even earlier than that, I think he banned so-called critical race theory from being integrated into Florida's education system and being imposed on children to, of course, as we know, sow the seeds of racial and ethnic discord among children, and to have them at one another's throats with this neo-Marxist oppressor versus oppressed paradigm, rather than having kids love each other, get along with one another, understand one another, become friends, regardless of race or ethnicity. It's absolutely disgusting, but you know, we're all familiar with that.
Is this going to spread to other states? Are they threatening other states besides Florida?
That I don't know. And yeah, this was the case. It wasn't directly targeted at Florida. Florida was in the news more focused on because of DeSantis's rising profile, as he is sort of a leader on the conservative side or dissident side in challenging some of these so-called woke orthodoxies and programs, but it will apply to all states. The USDA was saying that this is a guidance or recommendation or decree affecting all school food or lunch programs. I forget the exact term you guys used to describe that, who don't comply with this guidance recommendation to impose these corrupt curricula upon children.
Where is Canada on so in comparison to the United States, where is Canada when it comes to embracing this sort of woke ideologies in the school system? How do you guys compare?
Well, I want to make a distinction between the Canadian public and the Canadian government. And I'm sure that also applies in the U.S., as I don't think the American government is broadly reflective of the actual population that it ostensibly represents. And that goes to what I was saying earlier about this growing disconnect between actual Americans and their government. And of course, the same is true up here, actual Canadians and our government. Now, systemically, in terms of our institutions, my view is that we're a little bit further along this path of depravity and corruption than you guys are. Not that much further, but in a way, we sort of give you a preview of what to expect. So on the subject of, you know, so-called critical race theory, so-called transgender ideology, it's definitely integrated in public schools that I know of in this city, both through my own research of official statements issued by public school boards and through parents that I know who have kids in the system. So you've got this pronoun nonsense, you've got this racial and ethnic agitation, both in the curriculum and in the actual policies of school administrations. For example, like there's a local school board here in Ottawa that openly states, and this has been the case, I think, for 15 years at least, that they will have different methods of standard enforcement among their own staffers contingent on what their race or ethnicity is, given this arbitrary hierarchy of oppression that we're all familiar with.
Wow. We're getting down to the wire here. Last question. So given this disconnect, do you think it's possible that we can get back to a point where governments represent the actual desires of the people?
Joe, of course, if I didn't believe that was possible, I wouldn't do this for a living. So while, of course, I have some concerns about the near future, I do believe the future is not written. The future is for us to define. We are given God-given agency and freedom to carve our own futures. And let's just hope, as you said earlier, that Canadians make the right choices going forward, and more broadly, that we as a species make the right choices going forward to a more moral, lucrative, prosperous future for all of us.
Amen. Amen. Praise be to God. Robert Krychik has been our guest from Breitbart. You can check out his great articles over there. If you go to Breitbart.com and search for Robert Krychik, you'll find a whole list of them. And I encourage you to check out the one on the USDA. It's very troubling information. We have to push back on that. Robert, thank you for your time today. We're very grateful to you. God bless you, sir.
God bless you too. Cheers, guys. Bye.
All right, have a great day praying for Canada. All right, that's going to do it for hour number one. If you can join us in the second hour, David L. Gray is going to be on from the Gray Report, davidlgray.info. And we're going to talk about the purported miracle, the Eucharistic miracle in Mexico. What's going on there? Did it really happen? Did it not? We're going to have that conversation coming up. If you can't join us, come back tomorrow, same time, same place. We'd like to see you. We're going to have another great show. Until then, God bless you. God love you. Share us with a friend.